I've never tried it, but it'd be quite interesting, wouldn't it, to say,
Don't do it today.
yeah. What if you record in Russian and just see what happens? Maybe the computer says no. Right, let me start admitting all, and then we'll start. And thank you in advance, Rosalind. I'm
No problem.
looking forward to this one, as they say. So let's admit all.
See how it goes.
Here we go. Morning, Derek. Morning, Barry. Morning,
Morning.
Peter. Morning, Bryn. Morning, Jackie. Morning, Ellie. Morning, Henry. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining. If you could mute, please, that would be great. If we can try and cut out any background noise. Podrek, thank you very much. Ellie, if you could mute, please, that would be great as well. Thank you very much. Perfect. Okay. Thanks for the thumbs up, Podrek. That's really kind. Thank you. And thank you, Henry, for muting. Brilliant stuff. Actually, I'll mute my phone because that just went bing, so I'll mute that as well. So there we are. Right, okay. I think there'll be one or two stragglers, I think, from looking at the numbers. So we will do brief introductions. Welcome, everybody, to this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted to have the famous, very famous Rosalind Connor from Temple Bright to present Am I Bothered? Hopefully we are all bothered with our industry and all bothered with what's going on, but I think there's a very interesting presentation coming along, which hopefully you'll all enjoy. We are recording, so can we have a thumbs up? Rosalind, Derek, Henry, everybody, yep, that we're recording. And as usual, we are very interactive, so myself or Henry will encourage you to raise a hand if you want to challenge Rosalind, agree with Rosalind, or totally disagree with Rosalind. I'm sure she would love the debate. We will also open up the chat for any questions or any links which are pertinent to the presentation. But without any further ado, Rosalind, over to you, and let's see if these slides will work going forward. I think they will. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. So yes, I am going to share my slides. Last time I did this, the slides stopped moving forward. So if they're not moving forward, I'm expecting Steve will tell me. So hopefully people can see the screen now. This is my sort of analysis around the way in which trustees are, I think, increasingly in situations where employers are asking trustees to do things, and sometimes I think trustees aren't quite sure how to go about it. So I thought a bit of a discussion about sort of legal duties in that area might be quite useful. So what kind of thing am I talking about here? Well, to give you an example, let me see if it'll go forward. I hope it's gone forward there. Here's my employer. They didn't have many choices of people, so that's my employer, a man in a suit. And here are some of the many, many things I think employers ask trustees to do. Now, obviously, there are loads, and people that may have particular ones in their heads. But what I try to pick out here specifically are two things about these situations. They're all things where the employer is asking the trustee to do something because there is something that would help the employer if they did. Not the employer saying, I think it would be good for you, or it's mutually beneficial, but the employer saying, look, this affects me negatively if you don't and positively if you do, so please can you do it? And the other part of this, these are all things where from a legal point of view, they need trustee consent. So we're not talking about things here like, for instance, oh, you're doing a transaction, there's some kind of moral hazard. So, you know, for guidance and regulatory reasons, you want to go and engage with the trustees and see if you can get their consents. That's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at situations where trustees say no and you can't do it. So if you don't reach agreement with the trustees on your moral hazard, you can still do the deal. There's just risks attached to it. But if, for instance, the trustees say, no, I'm not going to close your scheme's not closed. Or if you decide you're going to, as trustees, use the surplus to augment members' benefits and there is less stroke none for the employer, that's just where it is. There isn't anything the employer can do about it. So legally, I'm looking at sort of scenarios where trustees have the power to say no, and if they say no, the thing doesn't happen, and therefore the bad effect that the employer wants to avoid happens, or the good effect that it's seeking doesn't happen. I think there are a lot of those. I do think there are a lot more than they were when I started in the last millennium doing pensions, which is, I just think in those days, maybe I wasn't getting the right experience. Others' experience might be different, but I think in those days, a lot of employers uh, didn't really go and ask the trustees for things. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it was more common then for trustees to just sort of go along with what employers wanted to do. I don't think that happened all the time, but there certainly were, there was a less obvious sort of different position. I think people didn't always acknowledge that there were different interests between trustees and employers. But also, I just think maybe we're in a world at the moment where the pension scheme is having a really big effect on the business or could have a big effect on the business. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about these types of decisions and how trustees might react to an employer saying, look, I want you to do this thing. And the reason I want you to do it is actually something that's good for me. So, question I'm asking, should the trustees be bothered by the employer's views? Should they do what the employer asks them to? Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question because for two reasons. One is I suspect the answer is almost always it depends. I mean, there will be some insane, obvious ones where you obviously never should or you obviously always should. But I think mostly it's contextual. Secondly, it turns out I am not the moral arbiter of the world. So my view on what trustees should and shouldn't do probably shouldn't instruct everyone else. What I'm going to do instead is answer questions about what trustees' legal obligations are, because that is something I can talk about. The reason I'm making that distinction is that I'm going to say should and ought to a lot in this. That isn't a moral judgment. It isn't a judgment about what I think ought to be happening in the world. It's a judgment about what trustees' legal obligations are. Why do trustees' legal obligations matter? Well, I think a lot of trustees are worried, sometimes more, sometimes less than they should be, about the risk to trustees personally of doing something that steps outside the legal framework, being in breach of trust. But also actually because some decisions that trustees make, if you make them in a way that really steps outside the legal framework, those decisions can be either void or voidable, i.e., you make the decision, everyone signs the contract, and the contract basically is treated by the law as if it doesn't exist. So one of those examples was, the employer asking the trustees to surrender a contingent asset. Well, imagine trustees, you surrender a charge, but your decision is void. Well, that charge is still in place, which means later trustees of that pension scheme can enforce that charge, or people aren't sure whether you can enforce the charge, all of which is just generally not good. So I think the legal structure does matter, and it is the thing I can talk to. So what I'm going to look at is a little bit about legal framework for trustee decisions, then a little bit about whether the law requires trustees to consider the effect on employer covenant on what they do, and if so, how much, to what extent. And then finally, are trustees legally required to consider things from the employer that aren't about covenant, requests that actually don't really affect their covenant one way or the other? And then I'm going to end up with a bit of opinion about, well, is this something? Actually, I'm not sure I know the answer. Is this something where maybe the law is perhaps not doing what we all want it to? And do we need to look at doing the law differently? I'm not sure the answer on that at all. But it would be interesting to know. Also, it would be lovely to have people's views on whether trustees should listen to the employer. Is there some kind of, outside the legal framework, some kind of moral duty around that? So I've come on to my next slide. I hope this shows the legal framework for trustee decisions. I'm not a very visual person. Give me words and numbers any day. That may be a bit obvious from this. Um, So trust law, what am I trying to show here? I'm trying to show the law around pensions law, about trustee decisions. decisions of pension trustees. And as you'll see, the vast majority of it comes from these trust law principles, which is case law that's been running for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's very nuanced and complex and really hard to pin down. There are big, long books written about it, none of which tell you everything. Probably the only way really to understand it is to go and be an expert in trust law. Possibly at a university. So it's big and it's complicated. And obviously, I'm not going to explain all of trust law because, firstly, you'd all just drop off the call, and secondly, I haven't got time. But the point is that that is the big bedrock of everything. And there are some points from it which I'm going to pull out because they really are fundamental. Now, legislation overrides case law. So the statutory obligations, so that's the Pensions Act, the Pension Schemes Act, the regulations, etc., sits to the side here. But actually, you can't just read that blind. You've got, because in terms of how it works as law, you have to then look at statutory and statutory interpretation in case law. So cases that tell you how you interpret words in the statute. And when it looks at that, when the courts look at that in relation to trusts, they will interpret it within the context of the principles of case law, of the trust law. So even that, before you can look at it, you've got to think about the trust law. And over to the side here, we've got a few cases which are about pensions law, specifically about pension, implying trust law to pension schemes, which are less helpful than you might think for two reasons. The first is there aren't that many of them. And finding a case where the wording of the deed is exactly the same as the one you've got and the circumstances are exactly the same, really hard. Secondly, they're all the court is not comfortable in giving general principles about pension schemes. So there's a lot of case law saying this is only relevant to these specific circumstances, please don't extrapolate, which does lead the question, well, why are you doing a reported case then if we're not able to extrapolate? So that is, if you like, the structure around trustee decisions and where trustee decisions are, how trustee decisions are made from a legal point of view. So where does this get us to? Sorry, just
Can we take questions during, or should we
oh
save them to the
yes,
end?
sorry, I can't see people properly, so if you're raising a question, please
Yeah,
do.
Bryn, whenever you
Yeah.
want. Yep.
Is there a hierarchy of case law between cases which have gone to the High Court, those who've gone to the Court of Appeal, or those who've gone to the Supreme Court? Does that make a difference to case law?
Well, I'm going to say the obvious lawyer thing, which is it really depends. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, of course, that something that's gone to a higher court overrides something in a lower court. But if you have a principle that is decided at high court, it's often not appealed above that because everyone thinks that must be right. And it's really well, particularly if it's a really clear judgment and that it really fits back to historic principles. That's a really, really strong decision. I think, yes, there is a hierarchy if you have a case law a case or a decision or a position that feels marginal or not, or like there are good arguments in the other direction. There, if it's only a high court decision, you can think, well, I'm sure if someone went to Court of Appeal, we might get a different decision. And so it feels something that is challengeable. But of course, until and unless someone challenges it, that's what the law says. There've been some quite interesting things coming out of auditors around the Virgin Media case where they've said, look, I know everyone's talking about how there's going to be this new case, there's actually a case going on at the moment that may affect it, or that DWP might change the law, but at the moment the law is what the Court of Appeal says, and that's absolutely right. You can't act as if the law is something else. So yeah, there is a hierarchy, but I think there's probably more of a hierarchy between case law that is backed up by a whole bunch of other case law on sort of, if you like, non-pensions cases, but on a broad period over time, and cases that feel a bit like an outlier where someone's just come up with a new principle. If that makes any sense. So if I can just sort of come on now to the trust law duties. So I'm not going to talk about all trust law duties, but I think most people will have heard about this overriding duty. So trustees have an overriding duty, is a fiduciary duty, which means it's a really, really strong duty to carry out the terms of the trust. Now, people often refer to that as acting in the interests of members or acting in the interests of the scheme, which isn't quite right, but it's not bad. I think it's quite a good shorthand for this kind of quite difficult to pin down concept of just carrying out the trust and working really, really hard at it, and letting that be the most important thing in what you do as a trustee. And I think the shorthand works as long as you remember it's not quite right. It's not literally correct, in the sense that acting in the interests of members here does not mean thinking about the members outside the scheme. You can't, or providing benefits that the scheme doesn't provide. So you can't, as a trustee, say, well, the scheme, imagine the scheme didn't have any augmentation power, but I'm going to give the members more benefits because I've got to act in their interests. No, you've got to provide them exactly the benefits that the scheme allows you and sets out for you to provide. And you mustn't under and you mustn't over provide. So it's quite a useful shorthand, as long as you don't, because every now and then people listen to that and then say, well, I've got to act in the interests of members, so I've got to not do something that means they lose their jobs. And unfortunately, as a trustee, that's not your legal duty. So acting in the interests of members, acting in the interests of the scheme, I think is fine. My personal view is that if I or any other lawyer says, oh, that's not quite right, feel free to tell them to get lost. That's just being irritating and lawyer-like. We all know what we mean by it, I would say. So that is, if you like, the overriding thing that we need to think about as trustees when answering, when making a decision. Sorry, I'm just trying to make this thing work. Right. On top of that, we have specific trust law principles dealing with the exercise of what are called trust powers. So basically, if trustees make a decision, it's not really the decision we're worrying about here, it's the implementation. Right? I don't care that the trustees have decided to augment benefits. I care that they do augment benefits. Now, every time trustees do something, they're exercising their powers, their trust powers. And there's a whole bunch of trust law around how you exercise powers. I particularly like this area because some of the names are great. So one of a couple of the principles which I think are really relevant here to this kind of thought process is you have to exercise powers within the limits of that power. So the power itself will probably have some limits set down in it. You can imagine an amendment power has a whole bunch of things you can't quite do at the moment. You can't quite do under those powers. It says you can, amend this, but not if it breaches Section 67. You can amend this, but not if it affects accrued benefits or whatever. It'll have provisions in there. Well, those are limits on that power. Limits might be elsewhere in the trust deed. In some circumstances, they might be implied, which really doesn't help us a great deal. That if you act outside that, if you exercise that power outside the limits, that's called excessive execution. Again, brilliant terminology here. The other concept I want to talk about is you, as trustees, have to exercise powers for the purpose for which they were given that power. Doing anything else is called a fraud on the power or acting outside the proper purpose. So obviously that means people have to start thinking, well, what is the purpose of the power? Which is often, but not always, what's the purpose of the scheme? So that I think is quite an interesting scenario we find ourselves in, because that comes up, I think, quite a lot when trustees start saying, well, I'm trying to, I want to do this thing. Well, am I acting within the purpose of that power or the scheme? It's quite a nebulous concept, so I thought I'd come up with a couple of examples. I've got my judge here, and here are a couple of examples, cases people may or may not know. The one on the left is the Hillsdown case, which basically said when trustees had a of a scheme which had no power to provide surplus back to the employer, but it did have a bulk transfer power. They couldn't use that bulk transfer power to transfer everyone to a mirror image scheme, and then that scheme had the power to provide the surplus to the employer. I.e., you couldn't use the bulk transfer power just to get round the rule that said you couldn't give the surplus to the employer. That's obviously not why you were given that power. And similarly, the case on the right is more recent. I think a lot of people will know this, the British Airways case, where the court said the trustees have a unilateral power of amendment. They can't use that to put in place benefits that the court held were ones that were effectively whole benefits that the employer didn't want to give people, and that people, weren't being promised. This was just the trustees taking on the role of being in charge of benefits. And that was where the High Court got to on that case. The Court of Appeal got to on that case. So these sort of give you some ideas of scenarios where people have really got caught by this. Generally, if you're ever in a situation and someone says, I know the rules say we can't do this, but I found a clever way around it, almost certainly that's going to be a fraud on the power, which I think the Hillsdown case very much is. But just more generally, it's very helpful for trustees when they're thinking about the employer asking them to do things and decisions they make generally to say, okay, what's the purpose of my power and what are the limits on it? Because that will help them work out what the legal structure is. Right, so let's start by looking at employer covenant. So statute, as of last year, we eventually have some legislation that references covenant. Until that time, covenant was not in the legislation. I know it's been talked about by the pensions regulator and by EIOPA for like 20 years, but it wasn't in the legislation. Well, does that mean that until now trustees didn't need to think about covenant? And does it mean that they only have to think about covenant when it comes to funding, which is obviously where it comes up in the funding regs? Well, absolutely not, because trustees' duties that we've already talked about their legal duties require them to consider covenant. They're trying to carry out the terms of the scheme, try to act in the interest of the scheme. They need to know if the employer's got the money for the scheme, i.e., if as trustees something is done which really, really messes up the covenant and the employer can't fund it anymore, and then the scheme is underfunded, the trustees have not really covered acted in accordance with their duties. Obviously they could have done if it wasn't their fault, but if they'd known that this was going to happen, that's really not consistent with those duties. They have to consider covenant because the legislation, the case law, the trust law tells them that they need to carry out the terms of the trust. And they can't do that if they haven't got the person who's funding the trust and their financial health in their mind. Also, I think people can get into arguments about purpose of powers. The purpose of the powers is not to bankrupt the employer. That doesn't necessarily mean that the employer might not bankrupt and the trustees are still within their purpose. But you can't be, as trustees, sort of pushing for the death of the employer, because that's probably not why you were given those powers. So what really interests me about this is that there's, as I say, the regulator and the industry has been banging on about covenant for 20 odd years, and yet we've only just got it into legislation. And it seems strange that people haven't been thinking about it before. Well, my argument is I think they absolutely have. And I think the reasons why the legislation didn't need to change is because I think it's really clear from the case law. There's a whole bunch of cases, well, when I say a whole bunch, 3, that talk about pension schemes having to think about the employer, and they talk about having regard to the employer. And often when people quote these, it sounds like what the judge is saying is you need to worry about what the employer wants. So we come back to my original question. Yes, you do need to be bothered because it matters what the employer wants. But actually, when you start looking at these cases, when they start talking about why you have to have regard to the employer, They then say, because remember, they're the ones that fund the scheme, and you need to make sure they're able to fund the scheme. So you've got to pay attention to them. What they're saying is pay attention to covenant. So why do I think we didn't have a statutory definition of covenant for ages? I don't think we needed one, because the principle of trust law said that you had to care about the covenant because you need to keep the scheme going. And in fact, we have cases, and the Edge cases from the 90s, saying effectively covenant is a thing. It's just that because they're judges, they didn't use nice, clear words like covenant. But that's what they're talking about. And I think that's really interesting. So absolutely, I think there's no question that the legal framework is that trustees need to care about covenant. But then we come on to how much. So here's my employer, and he's saying, you know, all those things I asked you to do, if you don't say yes, I will be less able to fund you in the future. The covenant support you get will go down. Now, my trustee, I tried to find someone who looked the opposite of my employer here. My trustee says, okay, that's very interesting, but I'm not looking at covenant in isolation. You're telling me if I don't say yes, the covenant goes down, but I've got to look at the other effects on the scheme. So if you can think of a scenario where your covenant is improved, but say at the same time your investment position goes down, or somehow the governance of the scheme goes down. I've certainly seen situations where employers have wanted trustees to do something that actually doesn't improve the covenant from the trustee's point of view, such as, removing of some contingent asset. So it's not good for the trustees on covenant side, probably, but on the flip side, they've said, okay, but if you do that, because that will be good for us, we will then, pay for someone to work for full time for the next year, cleaning up all the pensions data. And we hold a lot of it. So, the employer is effectively saying, this is a thing that is good for you. And so your loss of covenant is probably not the end of the world. So I think the trustees do have to say, okay, yeah, there's covenant, but it's not the only thing. I've got to look at all the other risks. And when I'm saying risks, I mean risks to me being able to provide everyone with the right benefits at the right time, which is, yes, partly funding and investment, but it's also partly administration and structure and all sorts of other things. I think one of the other obvious questions trustees need to ask is, or think about, is how well funded is my scheme? Hopefully they're not asking the employer that, they're probably asking their actuary that. But how well funded is my scheme? Because a covenant advisor said to me, and I'm sure this isn't unique, but it wasn't something I'd heard before, and I thought it was great, that if you're 70% funded, then you're 30% funded in your employer. And obviously that's a very different situation from a scheme that's, 150% funded on buyout. There is a level of funding where covenant matters a lot less. I expect you hit a level of funding where covenant stops mattering altogether, where people are saying, the chance of needing more money is effectively, from a statistical point of view, zero. And therefore, I'm just going to stop worrying about covenant from the point of view of the issue that we described before about having to make sure the scheme was properly funded. So I think it is fair to say that there is a number where a scheme just doesn't care about covenant at all. I think the number probably varies scheme to scheme, but also there are definitely a difference between a heavily underfunded scheme that knows it needs a lot of money from the employer and a scheme that's actually relatively confident that it probably doesn't, in terms of how much they're going to care about the covenant impact as part of their decision-making process. And then I'll come on to a couple of other points. And this is something where I really love other people's views now or later, which is, I think that as an industry, we're much more sophisticated consumers of actuarial advice and legal advice and possibly even investment advice than we are of covenant advice. I think that quite often, many of us who are not covenant advisors, and I'm not just saying the trustees, I think other advisors as well, certainly lawyers who aren't so great with numbers, tend to just look at the score, and they tend to see that if a covenant advisor tells them that the covenant is very strong, that somehow the covenant advisor is guaranteeing that the scheme, that the employer will not go bust. But none of us get angry with our actuary if 3 years after the last valuation we look back and say, well, you know, your assumptions were wrong. Well, of course they were wrong. We know they were wrong because we know they are very sophisticated, educated guesses by people who have very complex models and are much more likely to be right than the random. But there's no guarantee. And I think that we get the same thing with we don't get the same thing with covenant. We tend to assume that the covenant advisor is telling us something certain, but again, they're making predictions about the future, and like actuarial assumptions, the further into the future they go, the more uncertain those predictions are. So
We've
I've got
we've got a hand raised,
oh,
Rosalind, from
please,
Barry. So Barry, do you
Um,
want to unmute and ask a question, or?
yes,
please.
hi, Rosalind. I wanted to contest what you've just said. So, I have actually seen covenant advisors put probabilities on what they mean by a strong covenant. Like, it means that, one company in 10 would go bust within the next 10 years or whatever. So that the trustees do actually get a sense of what is actually meant by some of these terms, and they might look at it from the point of view of credit ratings, for example. A
Yeah.
triple A credit rating doesn't mean that you're not going to go bust. It just means that the probability is low, but there are probabilities attached to those credit ratings that you can use.
Yeah, and actually, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is the covenant advisor's fault. I think this is just that I I am shocked how often I come across trustees and other advisors, again, I say lawyers possibly most amongst them, who just look at the score. They don't look at the details, at those explanations. They don't look at the scenario testing underneath and the scenarios that how those scenarios were weighted, even though all that's sitting in the report. Because I think I think we have got to a place where even those of us who absolutely could never in a month of Sundays be an actuary sort of understand how actuarial valuations, well, not necessarily how they work, but we understand what is being told to us and the sort of likelihood structures around it and the probabilities around it. I think there is a much more of a tendency with covenant advice for people, I'm not saying everyone, but I think a lot of people just don't really get under the skin of it. It's not that it's not there, and that's really helpful where people do give you things like probabilities. But I really wish that more trustees read it, I suppose, and more other advisors, because people are making decisions. I've certainly heard people say, and this is the thing that really worries me. I've heard people say, well, we can't possibly do that thing because it reduces the covenant strength. And you think, well, firstly, there's a whole bunch of other stuff to look at. And secondly, what do you really mean by that? You do understand what you mean by that is that in some scenarios it would be worse and in some it would be better. And in fact, what's happened is the weighting has and the number of scenarios has got you more to worse than better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's necessarily what will happen in all circumstances. So I just think that people don't think about it. I suspect this call is full of people who do think about it. So that's that's
Point.
probably a difference.
Well, I
Point
think,
positive.
well, I
Yeah.
think, I think trustees should do more what I call reverse scenario planning. They should actually think about events that could occur and then think about how that could actually arise in their scheme situation.
Yeah,
And I don't think trustees do enough of that. And I think it's particularly important where they've got to a level of funding where they think the risk is very low. They still need to look at events that could
that
occur and
might
how they might arrive at those events,
absolutely,
and therefore how they might mitigate.
absolutely. Yes, no, I'd absolutely agree that you do need to, and again, a lot of the time that is available from your covenant advisor. It's not always asked for, and often it's provided and not read. Or I may be being unfair. I'm not sure it's always read. That's my concern.
Okay, we've got two more hands raised. Let's go Con first, and then we'll come to Henry. But Con, you go first.
Hi, Rosalind. Sorry I was late getting on. Had problems with making the link. This question of quantifying the likelihood of insolvency or the likelihood of failure of a firm, there's a real problem with actually expressing these values as percentages. Yeah, I mean, if you look, for example, at a AAA bond, it has between 0.1 and 0.2% liability of failing in a given year. That number's 1% when you're looking at single A, triple B, borderline, and doesn't get above 1.5% for investment grade credits. Now, that means that the risk that you're taking appears extremely small. But the nature of the problem is that that's 0.5% or 1% a year for the life of the scheme.
Yes.
And that's the nature of the problem. If you're just going to look at short run covenant strengths, you're not actually going to get a good measure of the long term situation. And added to which, it's not helped by the pension regulators' nonsense on timescales over which covenants have to be measured and assessed. They're complete and utter rubbish. But that's all I wanted to say. Be careful with the numbers, because the numbers can mislead very seriously.
Yeah, well, people aren't very good at percentages and probabilities anyway, as certainly there's a lot of evidence about legal evidence, about evidence in court, that people instinctively think they understand, or think that they emotionally understand percentages better than they do. So if you tell a jury something has X% of being chance of being a DNA match, they'll tend to see over 50% as 100% and under 50% as 0%. That seems to be when you do sort of studies of this. So I absolutely agree. I mean, percentages are great, probabilities are great, but there's always a challenge. And I also, just to say, I appreciate that one of the big challenges, and I think that's part of what you're getting at here, Con, is that the problem with your covenant risk is it's not a risk you can spread. It's not like if you think, oh, well, I don't want to be just invested in Tesco. I want to be invested in the retail market. I want to be invested in UK equities or whatever to spread my risk. But if you are a Tesco pension scheme, your covenant risk is with Tesco. It's not with Sainsbury's. So you're taking on the risk not just of the sector being in trouble, but your particular company being in trouble within that sector. There are sort of multiple failure points, and there's not much you can do about it. So I do appreciate, I'm not saying, to be clear, I'm not saying covenant isn't important. I just think that we can sometimes get to a place as trustees where we think that that kind of trumps everything else. And from a legal structuring point of view, it absolutely doesn't. It's just a really difficult risk to assess.
Actually, hedging your employer sponsor covenant is not something they would thank you for.
No, quite.
Nor should
Quite.
they.
No, quite.
Okay, thanks for that, Con. Henry, do you want to say your piece?
Yeah, well, I had two questions to ask. One relates to West Midlands, in particular Birmingham, and the fact that they are, to many people's minds, overpaying contributions to a scheme which they, at Birmingham, are seriously in surplus, and LGPS generally. And then another scheme, which is the Kensington bit, which is 200% in surplus, so 100% over. And they've decided they're not going to pay their contributions. So you have Birmingham having to pay their contributions where they can't afford to, and Kensington, who probably can afford to do whatever they like, yeah, but are not paying their contributions because they're in surplus. Have you got any comments to make on these two instances, Rosalind?
I mean, you know, this. I mean, I am in a room with so many actuaries in it. I'm not going to say that I understand exactly how much that surplus is a surplus that there is certainty on. I mean, I think there is always a, you know, this comes back, if you like, to the challenge that, you know, trustees really, you know, they really want to make sure that the scheme is well funded, and inevitably they end up, that means that their first concern isn't really whether the employer can afford it or not. I'm aware that Birmingham is, to all intents and purposes, insolvent as a council after it spent, as far as I can tell, about 15 years with political changes between parties and both of them reneging on each other's deals on a case they had lost and probably should never have taken. But you know, it does seem to me uncomfortable that a scheme that is overfunded should be getting contributions, and that trustees really shouldn't be focusing on getting more money in when they're in a place where they are assessing and their advisors are assessing that they've got enough money. And that really shouldn't be where they're coming to. I take the point that you need to be aware that the employer of employer covenant, because you might need money in the future and you don't know. I mean, Virgin Media and Lloyds have told us that, if nothing else has, that suddenly you might find yourself needing more money than you thought you did. But I do personally find it odd that that is a focus, and it doesn't to me sit particularly with where I think trustee duties land, but I may just not understand the actuarial position. I am very well aware that I am not an expert on that.
I mean, a lot of these covenants are sort of like not really a matter for people because the shareholders can't sit behind them. That's what's going on. But with these LGPS schemes, you know, the covenants really revert back to the people who actually pay council tax, yeah. Who are also the people suffering from the bankruptcy situation in Birmingham or the Grenfell situation in Kensington, where you know, terrible things have happened to a small number of, relatively small number of people, but at a really big level, and they haven't been resolved because there isn't the money there. So I'm just wondering whether there is a moral aspect to this which overrides these niceties of law. So people just say, well, this bloody makes sense to give these people the money when they need it.
You are preempting where I'm going to end up. I think there is, yes, the reason I am, as I said, I'm very clearly talking about the law is because I'm not saying about what people should and shouldn't do. But I think I'm going to end by saying, you know, is this the right legal structure? Because it might not be. If this is where the law pushes us, because I'm conscious that trustees are pushed by their legal obligations, and it's all very well for other people to be cross with them, but if you have a legal obligation, you've got legal obligation. Anyway, I don't disagree. I will come on to that.
Okay. Before we move on, Rosalind, Chris has got his hand up as well. So, Chris, what is your thoughts as an actuary in the room?
Oh, well, I was just replying to sort of one of the other questions on there, because there was a suggestion about there being a sort of level of where there's dependence and no dependence on the sponsor covenant, and I was just thinking in terms of the number of buy-ins that I've been involved with that have revealed some sort of areas where the rules haven't been followed exactly, and that generally involves a cost on the employer. Well, normally the scheme's got enough funding to cover it, but for a trustee to be confident that they don't need to rely on a sponsor covenant anymore, they'd have to be 100% confident that the benefits have been paid exactly in line with the rules and everything. And I think that's quite a difficult position to get to for most trustees, unless, well, even once they've been through that exercise, it can happen again.
Or there can be a case and we discover that actually what we all thought was fine isn't fine. So yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I certainly agree that 100% funding on buyout is not no dependence on the employer, but coming back to the numbers that people were talking about earlier, that particularly Henry mentioned earlier, 200% funding on buyout makes me think probably, there must be a number somewhere, and I just don't. As I say, I expect the number depends on the scheme, but there must be a number where you can say, conceptually. And again, I'm not saying complete eradication of risk. I mean, risk being so low that it's like, it's something that, well, if that happens, it's more likely that, there's a worldwide revolution and all property is abolished. I mean, it's really unlikely. So let's just move away from that as a possibility. Because I think that is the thing. We can't say to trustees, there is no risk in anything you do. And I think they need to think about the level of reliance of the employer when they think about how much they care about covenant in their actions. But yeah, no, I take your point. I certainly wouldn't see 100% funding on buyout as somehow, a true self-sufficiency, to use a term that it's funny to try and get actuaries to define because no one agrees on it.
Thanks.
If that's okay, I will go on to my next question, which is, what about the employer's other needs? So we've talked here about covenant, trustees having to take into the legal obligations of trustees to take into account covenant. What about when the employer says, I want you to do this, not because if you don't do it, then I can't support the scheme as well, but because I want you to, because of something else. And actually, it might be bad for your covenant position, but it might be good. But it's about what I need here. So my employer is going to say, look, it's good for the rest of my business if you agree to this. And the trustee says, yes, that's not the purpose of my scheme. So remember now the trustees' duties to, well, the trustees' use of their powers has to be in accordance with the purpose of those powers. And that often comes, not always, but often comes down to what's the purpose of the scheme overall. Well, said the employee, it is the purpose of your scheme because your scheme was set up to promote my business. It was set up by me. And the trustee says, well, yeah, was it? Not really. It was set up with that in mind, but it was set up specifically to incentivize employees. So that isn't a blanket sign off of everything you might want to do. And of course, one of the things we all find nowadays is a lot of pension schemes were established by employers for a bunch of employees who don't work there anymore, or for an employer that is now part of a much bigger group and that part of the business doesn't operate anymore. I've certainly advised a whole bunch of schemes which are to do with people who did a thing that the business stopped doing years ago. And so it really isn't about current workforce. So the scheme wasn't set up to promote that other business. So no. At which point the employer pulls out of his pocket his favourite line, which is that the business is a beneficiary of the pension scheme. The employer is a beneficiary. Well, yes, sometimes. By which I mean, if your scheme allows a return of surplus to the employer, it might be a beneficiary in those circumstances. But that doesn't mean they should be considered as a beneficiary in terms of things that are nothing to do with that analysis. So when you're thinking about how you distribute surplus, obviously there the employer is a beneficiary. You can't ignore the employer's interest any more than you can ignore the members' interests in that surplus. When you are thinking about whether you dissipate a surplus, whether you risk a surplus that the employer will be the ones to get their hands on, you probably have to think about the employer there. Now, it doesn't mean it overrides your other thoughts, but it does mean you have to think about it. But generally, difficult argument to run, and it's not helped by our judge, who in the Court of Appeal British Airways case, that argument was raised, the argument that the employer is the beneficiary was raised, and the court said that they found that argument unhelpful. That is quite a big diss from a judge. That is not, judges rarely say, they will sometimes, but they rarely say, I think that is just incorrect. But saying they find an argument or a position does not help them is a very strong signal that says, don't come before the courts again and argue that. Now, that's not to say people won't go before the courts and argue that, but it's a very good signal that that argument is not one that's likely to be successful. And if you did argue that, the person opposing you would point out that the Court of Appeal have already said that that's an unhelpful argument. So sorry, my phone has just gone off. That's very helpful. So what I am trying to say with this slide is, from a legal point of view, now this is nuanced, this is not absolute slam dunk, but from a legal point of view, it's not an easy argument to say that trustees ought to consider the employer's needs legally when they're making decisions, when they're not talking about supporting the covenant. Now, again, as I've said several times, I'm not saying that's right. I just think that that is where the law stands, and I'm pretty confident on that. That's not an outlying legal position, I'm afraid. So,
Okay. Another hand, right? It's Con. Before we move on, Con, do you want to unmute and just ask your question or make your point?
Yeah, Rosalind, I think that the point I would make is it is good for the rest of my business and your covenant.
well, yeah, and if in situations where you can make that, then I think that is
Well, if
that
it's
is
good
the
for if it's good for the rest of my business, it's clearly good for my covenant.
well, it's not necessarily, is it? So it may be good for the rest of my business for you to release a
That's
a
illegal.
charge
That's
you
a
have.
legal hair split that you have very
No,
very
no, I
difficult to
don't
do
think
in the
so.
numbers.
No, I think if I were as the employer saying what will be good for my business is if I refinance and that requires you to surrender your charge over that asset. That might be quite difficult to say that is good for the covenant for the trustees, because good for the business as a whole doesn't mean good for the support that the business can give the pension scheme. And actually, I'm increasingly seeing exactly those scenarios happening where employers are trying to get trustees to give up some kind of security they gave them in the past, to unwind an ABF, to give up a contingent asset, because the employer wants it for the good of the employer's business. So that's my point, is I think that happens quite a lot now. It didn't used to, but it happens quite a lot. It's not splitting hairs. That's a very, very difficult scenario, I'd say.
There's another question before we move on from Peter Cameron Brown. Peter, do you want to unmute or do you want me to ask the question?
Well, it's just really a sort of marker I was putting down when I was thinking about all this, is where do trustees' considerations of discretionary benefits fit in all this scenario? You may be coming on to it, but I was just...
No, I mean, I think you're right. I haven't gone into it because I thought that would take us a long time. I mean, trustees' consideration of discretionary benefits is trustees exercising a power. So they have a power under the scheme to provide discretionary benefits. They don't have to. So the purpose of the scheme does include providing discretionary benefits, but it also includes not doing. So it's one of those really unhelpful ones where the law, I think discretions are really tough in legally, because the law doesn't really tell you what to do. It specifically says, well, it's up to you. And things like you've got to consider all relevant issues and no irrelevant issues without any explanation on what those are. So it doesn't, discretionary benefits are within the purposes, and I think that's where, you know, that share of surplus on wind up is about a discretion, in the same way it's about trustees saying, well, who would I like to give this to? And generally the courts won't criticize you as long as you have thought about it carefully and thought about everyone. So I'd say with discretionary benefits, the way the trustees keep themselves comfortable and safe is that they consider both giving them and not giving them, and make a decision having genuinely thought about both sides of the table, as it were.
Okay, thanks, Rosalind. Bryn, you've got your hand up. Would you want to make a point?
Yes, I just wondered if Rosalind had got a view on the Arcadia Group case. The judgment has just been made. It sort of deals with these issues. I've got a separate grumble about that case, that in the full judge. This is where there were two schemes, and one in surplus, one not in surplus, and the judge allowed them to merge those schemes. A question that was never asked, as far as I could tell, anywhere in the case, certainly not mentioned, the judgment is why there were two schemes in the first place, which seems highly relevant to how you handle that issue. But is this part of what, does this fit within what you're saying? To my mind, and I'm always paranoid about these things, it seemed a lot more pro-employer than what you've just been saying.
Yes, I think you're right. I think a lot of these, I think there certainly has been a sort of move in judgments. Is that certainly 20 years ago they were all seemed terribly pro-employer, and then they started being a lot more, if you like, defending the trustees and the members against the employer. And I think you're right. There's a bit of a feeling of a swing back happening at the moment. I think, Safeway and BA and Turner and Newell and Arcadia all, to me, feel like cases where the result is a lot more pro-employer than you would have expected. And I suppose my answer on that is I don't. I'm always nervous about seeing a trend in, having just said I think there's a trend, seeing a trend in case law, because we're often a bit too close to the coalface to see whether it's trending that way. And it may be that the next case we have swings back the other way. I simply don't know. But I agree that there's as I said at the beginning, trust law is complex and you can always dig out something. It was once said to me by a relatively eminent religious leader that the most dangerous document he knew was the Old Testament, because you could probably prove anything from it because it has so many different things within it. And that doesn't mean it's not consistent and it's not saying something important. And I think the same, I would say, is true of trust law. You can get to a certain place quite often on things. And I do feel at the moment there's a number of cases that have surprised me as being more pro-employer than I would expect. But, I'm not, I can't at the same time sort of pick a hole in them. And I wouldn't dare, frankly, because I don't, I'm not as eminent as the judges making those decisions. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The Arcadia case resulted in something which makes a lot of employers breathe a sigh of relief, I'd say, which may or may not be where we want them to be. But if I could sort of come on to my last point here. So where does that leave us? This is my summary. Yes, trustees should be bothered about the employer covenant. It's needed so they can carry out the terms of the trust, but it doesn't trump everything else. We've talked about how it's complex and getting it right is difficult. But legally, usually trustees don't need to be bothered about employers' views that are not to do with covenant. I mean, I take Con's point that very often the two are wrapped up together, but what I tend to find is that employers start by saying, oh, it's about the covenant, and then they start piling in a whole bunch of stuff that's nothing to do with the covenant at all. And trustees have to be slightly careful to separate the two. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are circumstances where trustees do need to be bothered about what the employer wants, and it's not to do with covenant. And I mentioned a couple there. So where does that leave us? Well, does this mean for those people who are concerned about, running schemes on and encouraging employers to reopen them up and incentivizing employers to have pension schemes? Well, we might think that ship has sailed, and I think that's not an invalid argument. And it might think that it's a risk we don't want to take of sort of changing this structure. But what I suppose I'm trying to say is that trust structure results in some positions which are slightly unexpected and aren't quite possibly where people think they're going, and where people want to go, and not easily dealt with necessarily by just sort of topping up trust law with a bunch of regulations that say something slightly different. And I am reminded that many years ago, when I started off as a pensions lawyer, going to a talk by one of the earlier pensions ombudsmen, a guy called David Laverick. Now, Laverick was not a trust lawyer, unlike his predecessor and the people who come after him. He was a public law person. Public law doesn't have trust law in it, and it's largely based on regulation. And he said the problem with pension schemes and the management of pension schemes is trust law, because it doesn't do what people with public policy want it to do and what we all are expecting it to do, and it sometimes takes us off in the wrong angle. So really it would be great if we just passed a law saying that trust law doesn't apply to pensions, and just instead have pensions work under a set of regulations. Now, I think there are lots of reasons why that might not work, and that might not be a good way to go. But at the time, I thought, oh, that's just rubbish, and that's because he doesn't understand trust law, because he's not as clever as me, because I was young and arrogant rather than old and arrogant, which I am now. But the more I think about these issues, the more I sort of understand where he's coming from. I'm still not sure I agree with him. I don't think I do agree with him, but I think it is really interesting that trust law doesn't do what people would like it to do. And quite often when you listen to policy proposals coming out of both the current and the former government, that there's not really an understanding about how trust law sort of washes across these things. And maybe if we are going to have policies that protect schemes but don't have them at 200% funded, and get things to the place that people think are the right place to get to, maybe trust law isn't necessarily helping us. I don't know, but I thought I would raise that question.
Rosalind, thank you very, very much. That's been a fantastic session. Charles, final. We're slightly overrunning, but final question from you, Charles, and then we'll wrap up. But do you want to unmute, Charles, and ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much, and hi, Con. Hope you're feeling well. Very interesting, Rosalind. The one point that hasn't been covered in this conversation has been special circumstances. Now, as I understand it, the trustees' obligation is A, to consider the scheme members, B, to work towards a healthy sponsor, and C, to work around special circumstances. Now, I totally get the conversation between your good self and Con in terms of how do you define risk, nearer and longer term. But my question is, if it is true, and I believe it is, that special circumstances ought to be taken into account, I don't know what proportion of the decision might go to special circumstances, and I expect your answer is going to be it depends. But I just thought I'd flag that question. And for example, in our case, we had a huge millstone of a DB pension scheme around our necks. It nearly put us out of business twice. And it certainly destroyed all profits for at least 3 years. Never mind lack of investment opportunities. And if you don't invest, you're standing still, and everyone else is going forward. And in our case, before my time, there were 35 years of almost nil investment in a UK manufacturing outfit tied to the construction industry. I was able to argue with the trustees, look, we are cash strapped, our head is just above water, all of the premises is rotting through, doors, windows, roofs, you name it, 3.5 acre site. Let's taper the so-called recovery plan. And just as an ancillary point, and you mentioned language, You know, you've heard of friendly fire. The use of language to obfuscate coming out of Whitehall. Sometimes they get groovy phrases that alliterate, as you alluded to. But, you know, words like deficit, I mean, how do you define a deficit? Is it enough to pay your scheme members? Is it enough to satisfy the completely artificial calculation that comes up with the actuarial deficit? Is it buyout? Is it run on? I'm not a professional pension bod, very far from. I've been on an extremely steep learning curve over the last few years. Con will attest to my ignorance prior. But where in amongst this calculation, and I can see that it's an ethereal calculation on probability percentages of funding, where does special circumstances come in, and how can it be calibrated in terms of the gravity of the special circumstances compared with the two other at times at odds priorities of, you know, maximizing the benefit for scheme members and supporting the sponsor for, you know, the medium to longer term.
Yeah, and this is the challenge, isn't it? Because you know, if I was being an annoying lawyer about that, I'd say you're not actually looking at any of those three things. You're providing the benefits under the scheme, which does not mean you maximise benefits to members. You're not supporting the employer. That's not your job. But you know, in practice, that's exactly what it ends up boiling down to, right? Because, you know, if you have a scheme that isn't beautifully funded, you're having to think, are we going to be able to pay people's benefits? And how do we balance that against not destroying the business on the way through, which is obviously not going to do anyone any good? And I think the answer on all this, and how do I look at the challenging scenario that people are in, and I think the problem with all this is it does come down to the fact that, you know, trust law is always focused on the here and now. It's focused on trustees making decisions in the current scenario about their current position. And one of the reasons we ended up with an awful lot of legislation around pensions is because that can result in trustees trying to do the right thing, thinking they're doing absolutely the right thing, and ending up with a massively underfunded scheme or some massive hole somewhere or some massive mistake somewhere because they haven't focused on something that just didn't occur to them to focus on at that time. So I think the problem is that trust law doesn't help us much in terms of giving trustees a duty to look at all these different things, and you know they are having to make their own decision, and it is their decision, not anyone else's, balancing all these different risks. And I would say a lot of trustees don't necessarily fully understand all those risks. In fact, I don't think any of us fully understand all the risks. We probably all around this call understand different bits of the risks. And you know, they need decent advice on these things. You know, we do have to remember that until the 95 Act, you weren't, as a trustee, obliged to be taking advice on a lot of these issues, and there's still lots of things you're not obliged to take advice on as trustees. So I do think I think it is a challenge because trust law doesn't, and trustees don't have a legal duty to get it right. They have a legal duty to try. Now, obviously, they don't have a legal duty to get it right because we don't want to be able to sue trustees because something weird happened in the market and they didn't see it coming.
Resign.
Well, exactly. It's not. You know, nobody would do it. We're not going to use that as a guarantee, but I do think that there is a continuing education that all of us need in the industry because it's so big and so complex, and the risks are so complex, and we all understand different bits of it. And I'm not quite sure. Sorry, that wasn't a very helpful answer. My answer
That's
is
all right. It was a very legalistic answer.
Oh dear, I hope
Just
not.
one other supplementary point about risk. something that struck me on my learning curve was that our group of manufacturing companies were deemed as low risk by Lloyd's and low risk by Dun & Bradstreet, and then high risk by Experian. So when it comes to discussing risk based analysis, I understand that the fellow who wrote the algorithm for Experian knew fully well in 2016 that the risk score analysis would favour the large players and penalise the vast majority of small players. So I just wanted to throw that one in. Thank God they've gone back to Dun & Bradstreet, frankly. But that really pinched a lot of small schemes in terms of the PPF levy.
And isn't that one of the challenges, that because our industry has become so complex, there are so many of these consultations on changes to things, and every time PPF makes significant changes, it puts out a consultation. Now, I'm not saying it may have been the case lots of people responded and it was ignored, but I do know a number of people who said, I didn't realize that was happening until afterwards, and there were points I would have made.
That's absolutely pertinent to us. I'm chairman of the SME consultation group. We've got 2 seats in the PPF forum. We're recognised by the DWP. We only got ourselves together because of the 2016 valuation. I would describe that apparently not a single SME made a representation to the PPF. I would characterize that episode as equivalent to a drive-by shooting.
Yeah, yes, I
Yeah,
can see that.
yeah. Well, that's why we organised.
Yeah,
Can I
no,
just
that
come
makes
in,
sense.
Rosalind? Yes, the pensions regulator consults left, right, and centre on all of this stuff, and then they do whatever the bloody hell they had already decided to do before the consultation.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are many different people who consult, and sometimes, and what I would say in defence of the pensions regulator is I had that experience a lot recently. With the APL, we really haven't had that experience. Regulators been a lot more engaged in actually listening. We found over the last year or 2. Don't know why. Or maybe we've just got better.
They haven't got a forum,
Rosalind, Rosalind, that's enlightened self-interest. Everyone down in Brighton, the pensions regulator, has seen how much lawyers' salaries have gone up.
Well, it's after 20 years of the pensions regulator deciding that lawyers were not a group of people that should be allowed to be important in the regulator or speak to each other or have anything to do with policy. So they seem to have at last realised might be a good idea to check the law before you write new ones. But no, what I would say is I think when I said lots of consultation, there's a regulator, there's PPF, DWP, loads of different people will consult, HMRC, and sometimes they're really good at listening and sometimes they're really terrible. And I suspect it comes down to whether there is a policy person who strongly wants to make sure something happens, or a person who has decided. I always wondered if Experian was cheaper than Dun & Bradstreet. Don't know. That someone had decided that's where they're going, and they were going to, exactly as you say, they're going to consult and then just do it anyway. But I do think it varies. Some consultations are really good, and some consultations feel like they're going through the motion. But there are thousands of them. As I say, I sit on the APL Legislative Parliamentary Committee. We always have each monthly meeting 2 or 3 consultations, and we're not looking at all of the ones that the APL are looking at. And then there are a whole bunch that we don't look at because there's no legal angle to it. So, there are so many in the industry, and it's because it's big and it's complex, and it would be really annoying if they didn't ask us, but then they ask us and we don't look at it all anyway. So I'm not offering any solutions here.
There we go. There we go.
Very legal.
Very indeed. Well, I'm sure everybody will join me to thank you, Rosalind, for a great session. And yeah, lots to chew over and mull over. And will you be able to send the slideshow through? Would that be possible? Or
Yeah.
are you happy to release that?
Yeah,
Lots of
absolutely.
claps, by the way. Chris,
Oh,
Barry,
thank you.
yeah, Peter, lots of claps.
So
if you
yeah,
could send us that,
if I
anybody
send
wants a
that to
copy
you,
of that.
Steve, you
Yeah,
can
send it to
you
me.
can,
If anybody
yeah.
wants a copy of the slides, then please come to me or Henry, obviously. But I really appreciate your time, Rosalind. Fantastic presentation as usual, highest quality. And as Con says, hope you get a pay rise. So there you go.
Yeah, well, yeah. Apparently, I'm buying all the drinks.
And
Who
you're
knew?
buying the drinks next time. So there we are.
Apparently.
So good stuff. All right.
Thanks.
Appreciate today. Thanks everyone for joining, and
Thanks
we'll
so
see you
much.
next week. Thanks very much
Thank
indeed.
you,
All right.
Rosalind. Thank you,
Take
Thank
folks.
care.
you.
Cheers,
Bye
Charles.
bye.
Thanks, bye.
Con. Thanks. Bye. Bye.